Jonah, the Iron Hand of the Slums. NeoAlexandria, Lower District, 2135. Before the world knew him as Jonah the Blade, he was just another boy who had learned too quickly that survival was a currency often paid in blood. The slums didn't allow children to grow slowly. They threw them into the fire early, letting hunger and desperation shape whatever emerged. Jonah's father had disappeared one night, swallowed by the alleys he warned his son never to wander. His mother worked until her hands bled, but food didn't stretch as far as it used to. By the time Jonah turned 12, he knew every crack in the lower district streets, and which ones held danger beneath their surface. The lower district of NeoAlexandria didn't shape warriors, it ground them down until all that remained were sharp edges and broken glass. Jonah was one of those edges, tempered by years in the shadows of the towering spires that loomed above the slums. It was in the lower district that he learned how to disappear, how to fight, and, most importantly, how to wait. The market square was a symphony of chaos, where voices collided like dueling blades, and desperation was the only language spoken fluently. The air hung thick with the tang of rusting metal, overripe fruit, and the faint chemical bite of black market tech. Underfoot, the uneven cobblestones pressed uncomfortably against the soles of worn shoes, forcing every step to be deliberate. Smoke from nearby street fires curled like serpents, coiling around Jonah's legs as he navigated the crowd, his senses sharp and alert. Vendors barked at each other over crates of smuggled parts, selling tech so stripped of identity that it could have come from any district, upper, lower, or somewhere in between. Jonah's stomach gnawed at him, but he ignored it. Hunger made him sharper, made him colder. He waited like a coiled spring at the edge of the crowd, his eyes scanning the currents for the right kind of mark. She appeared in flashes, first the billow of her red cloak, then the glint of the satchel strapped tight at her side. Her walk had a deliberate, fluid grace, the kind Jonah recognized in people who carried both secrets and weapons. There was a confidence in the set of her shoulders, but it was the way she glanced to the side without turning her head that caught his attention, like a predator aware of every movement around her, ready to strike or disappear in equal measure. Her face remained obscured by the hood's shadow, save for a faint scar that trailed along her jawline, catching the light for the briefest moment as she passed. Her path cut through the market like she belonged, but Jonah knew better. She wasn't from here. Not really. His shadow moved before he did, sliding between bodies as if pulled by gravity. The slums had taught him how to read the gaps, how to slip into them so seamlessly that the city seemed to part around him. One breath, one brush of his fingers, and the satchel fell away like ripe fruit from a branch. It wasn't until he rounded the corner that he realized the mistake. A steel vise clamped onto his shoulder, and suddenly the world jolted. Jonah twisted, the knife he had palmed flashing upward, but the strike was caught mid-air. The hand gripping him didn't falter. "Fast," said the voice above him, smooth but sharp as glass. But not fast enough. He looked up to find the woman staring at him with eyes that seemed to weigh his worth like scales in an old marketplace. Her hair was cut short and uneven, and she wore her confidence like a blade strapped at the hip, plain to see, but dangerous to touch. "I didn't take anything," Jonah lied, the knife still trembling in his grip. She plucked the satchel from his belt as easily as lifting a feather. "Then what's this?" Jonah's heart thudded once. Twice. His grip tightened instinctively on the knife, but he knew it wouldn't help. 1,000 possibilities raced through his mind, none of them good. His ribs tensed, anticipating the sharp kiss of punishment, but the blow didn't land. Instead, a cold weight pressed down, heavier than any fist. Why hadn't she hit him? What game was this? Jonah swallowed hard, uncertain whether to thank fate or curse it. Mercy didn't exist in the lower district. Whatever she wanted, it would cost him more than a few stolen coins. Instead, she stepped back, appraising him like a merchant contemplating flawed goods. "You've got talent," she said finally. "But you're wasting it." Jonah's pulse slowed, but he didn't lower the knife. "I get by." Her gaze pinned him like a butterfly in glass. "Getting by won't save you down here." "Who are you?" Jonah asked, not sure if he cared for the answer. "Someone who used to be you," she replied, turning toward the street without haste. "Name's Greta Heller. If you want more than getting by, meet me at the Black Gate by sundown." She paused just long enough to glance over her shoulder. "Or stay hungry." The Black Gate was a myth whispered among the forgotten, a place where the rules of the lower district bent like molten steel. Some said it was a meeting ground for those too dangerous for even the slums to handle: mercenaries, assassins, and engineers with more blood on their hands than grease. Others believed it was a sanctuary for the desperate, where debts were repaid in skill or silence. But no matter the version of the tale, one detail remained the same: those who entered rarely came out unchanged. Jonah had never crossed it, few had, and fewer still returned with stories that held shape. As he leaned against the crumbling wall beneath the rusted arch, he wondered if he had miscalculated. Greta had the look of someone who made promises lightly but carried heavy consequences. The sun bled low over the market, shadows stretching like veins through the streets. Figures passed in and out of the gate, some armored in steel, others in silence. Jonah watched, taking measure of the weight they carried: guns, knives, scars that told their own stories. He almost laughed. Almost. But Greta appeared again, stepping from the alley with the unbothered grace of someone who had walked these streets longer than he'd been alive. "Thought you'd run," she said as if greeting an old friend. Jonah shrugged. "Thought about it." Greta smirked, motioning for him to follow. The Black Gate swallowed them both. Inside, the lower district bent into unfamiliar shapes, alleyways Jonah had never crossed, corners that seemed to twist inward. Fires flickered low in half-barrel drums, and figures shifted in the dark, faces drawn but watchful. They stopped at a reinforced door hammered into the skeleton of an old factory. Greta knocked twice. A slit opened, then shut again. The door creaked inward. Jonah stepped through and met the forge. The air hit him first, dense and heavy, thick with the scent of burning oil and iron filings. Each breath carried the tang of scorched metal, making his lungs feel weighted. Sparks burst in chaotic flares from every corner, flashing like miniature stars before fizzling into nothing. The walls, slick with soot and grime, seemed to hum with the steady rhythm of hammer on steel. Machinery lined the far edges of the room, half-shrouded in shadow, their gears grinding softly like restless beasts waiting for the right command. Jonah's boots scuffed against the gritty floor, feeling the fine layer of metallic dust beneath his feet. Each step echoed, swallowed by the ambient symphony of tools at work. He could feel the heat radiating from the heart of the forge, an invisible boundary between the world he had known and the one Greta was leading him into. To his left, a hunched figure hammered away at a blade, his arm rising and falling in smooth, practiced arcs. The sparks illuminated the hard lines of his face, highlighting eyes that never strayed from the steel beneath his hammer. The forge wasn't just a place, it was alive, breathing with the rhythm of those who shaped it. Jonah wasn't sure if he belonged here, but he knew he wanted to. It wasn't a room. It was a den. Sparks flew like fireflies, welding torches searing into the dark as hunched figures worked at tables covered in tools and steel. The air smelled of oil and raw metal, of sweat and something more: possibility. At the far end sat a glass case. Within it lay a blade, polished to the point that it seemed to drink the light around it. Jonah's feet carried him toward it before he could think. "That," Greta said from behind him, "belongs to those who earn it." He traced a finger along the glass, imagining the weight in his hand. One day. And somewhere in the dark, a forge hammer rang like a heartbeat. Jonah's breath caught as the sound resonated through his bones, vibrating with a weight that felt older than the streets he had grown up on. It was steady, relentless, and unforgiving, like the city itself. In that moment, Jonah realized the forge wasn't just crafting weapons. It was shaping the people who stood within its walls, hammering out weakness and hesitation stroke by stroke. The rhythm stayed with him long after he stepped away from the glass case, each echo planting roots in his chest. This was more than survival. This was the beginning of something far greater, and Jonah knew he couldn't turn back. And that's where it all began. Jonah, tempered by fire. NeoAlexandria, Lower District, 2136. Jonah's apprenticeship at the Black Gate began the next morning. The forge's fires hissed in protest at the damp, choking air, the remnants of steam curling like snakes around Jonah's ankles as he stepped inside. The hammering began before dawn, relentless and punishing, each strike echoing through the cavernous workshop like the heartbeat of some great, slumbering beast. Greta was nowhere to be seen, leaving Jonah under the relentless glare of Bram, the forge master whose arms were as thick as iron bars and whose scowl could strip paint from steel. Bram's patience wore thinner than the edge of the daggers he shaped, and Jonah could feel it fraying with every misstep he made. "Pick it up, boy. Steel doesn't bend for the lazy." Bram's voice carried over the roar of the furnace, heavy as the hammer in his hand. Jonah wiped the sweat from his brow, adjusting his grip on the tongs. His fingers ached, blistered from hours spent holding glowing rods of metal while Bram's hammer molded them into blades. Each sting from his burned skin felt like the forge had found another layer to strip away. His thoughts drifted to the street outside, where shadows stretched cool and inviting. But there was no escape, not from this heat, not from Bram's hawk-eyed stare. Get through this, Jonah thought, and maybe I'll still have enough fingers to hold the knife I shape. Again. Bram wasn't satisfied with anything less than perfection. Jonah wasn't sure if he hated or respected that. Maybe both. By the third day, Jonah's hands were raw, each nerve burning with every strike of the hammer, like molten threads threading through his veins. The pain wasn't sharp but deep, lingering beneath the skin as if the forge had planted something inside him, growing with every blow. The heat felt alive, pressing against him like a great iron beast, breathing in unison with the hammer's fall. Jonah let the ache wrap around him, a reminder that he was still standing, still moving. The forge demanded more than strength, it pulled at the soul, carving away weakness until only the iron beneath remained. In that harsh, punishing rhythm, Jonah found a strange kind of peace, as though the flames had burned away the noise of the lower district and left him floating in the silence between hammer strikes. That evening, Greta returned. She leaned casually against the doorway, watching Jonah finish shaping a dagger's edge. "You're still here," she remarked, a flicker of approval in her tone. Jonah held up the blade, letting the firelight dance along its edge. The metal hummed faintly in his hand, not with sound, but with something deeper, a promise, perhaps. The edge gleamed sharper than survival, sharper than hunger. It wasn't just steel, it was potential shaped by fire and discipline, something that would outlast bruises and the sting of failure. Greta smiled faintly. "You like the blade." Jonah lowered it, his fingers lingering on the hilt as if the weight anchored him. The blade wasn't just a tool. It was a future cut free from the chains of the lower district, a symbol that whispered of a life not yet lived. Isn't that the point? Greta stepped inside, her gaze drifting over the other apprentices, most older than Jonah by several years. "The point is to survive, Jonah. The blade's just a piece of steel until someone gives it a reason to exist. People get sentimental over weapons, but in the end, it won't hesitate to break if you're not the one holding it right." Bram grunted from the forge, not bothering to look up. "He'll survive. If he doesn't pass out first." Jonah felt the weight of Greta's gaze linger a moment longer before she crossed the room, setting a small, wrapped bundle on the table. "Eat," she instructed. "Bram will work you to death if you let him." Jonah peeled back the cloth, revealing bread and smoked meat, a feast compared to the scraps he was used to. He hesitated, glancing up at Greta. "Why are you helping me?" Greta's expression hardened, but Jonah caught it, the flicker in her eyes, a brief slip of something unguarded. It was a look he had seen in the mirror more than once, when he thought too long about the faces he no longer remembered. "Because someone once did the same for me," she said, but there was weight in those words, as if she carried the name of that someone like a blade pressed to her heart. Whatever that memory was, it didn't belong in this room, and Greta buried it with a glance toward the forge. "Eat. It won't taste as good cold." She left without another word, disappearing into the night as silently as she had come. Jonah ate quickly, knowing that tomorrow, the forge's fires would demand more from him, and he would be ready. The blade was not the point. But one day, it would be his. The following weeks blurred into a relentless cycle of heat, hammer, and exhaustion. Jonah's muscles ached in ways he hadn't known possible, his back stiff from bending over anvils for hours. But there was a quiet pride growing in his chest. He could see the progress, each dagger sharper, each edge cleaner. The forge began to recognize him, and Bram's grunts of disapproval turned to brief nods of acknowledgement. One evening, as the sun dipped below the fractured skyline, Jonah lingered by the furnace, wiping down his tools. Greta's footsteps echoed behind him. "You're picking this up faster than I thought," she said, arms crossed. "Bram says you haven't cried once." Jonah smirked. "Crying doesn't shape steel." Greta chuckled, though her eyes remained serious. She stepped closer, pulling something from the folds of her cloak, a thin, polished throwing knife. The blade glimmered in the dim light, its edge reflecting the flames behind Jonah. She twirled it between her fingers with practiced ease. "You've done well, but let's see if you're as good away from the anvil," she said, holding the knife out to him. "Catch." The blade flashed in the air. Jonah snatched it mid-spin, the cold steel biting into his palm. He held it firm, fingers curling around the hilt. Greta nodded approvingly. "Good reflexes. There's more to this life than shaping metal. You have to know how to use it." She motioned for him to follow. They stepped outside into the alley behind the forge. The air was cooler, carrying the distant hum of market chatter. Greta gestured to a stack of barrels lined against the wall. "Hit the center," she instructed. Jonah narrowed his eyes, gauging the distance. He mimicked Greta's earlier motion, twisting his wrist and sending the blade spiraling through the air. It struck the barrel's side, embedding itself just shy of the center mark. Greta raised a brow. "Not bad for your first try." Jonah retrieved the knife, passing it between his hands thoughtfully. The weight felt natural, as if it belonged there, but Jonah knew better. A blade was a lie, sharp, cold, and eager to betray the weak hand that held it. "Is this part of the apprenticeship?" "It is now," Greta replied, her eyes narrowing like she saw straight through him. "The lower district has little patience for smiths who can't defend their work. And less for those who think a blade alone keeps them safe." Jonah turned the knife over in his palm, feeling the subtle balance shift. Her meaning wasn't lost on him. In the slums, a blade was more than a weapon. It was a challenge, an invitation for blood. And if he wasn't the one cutting, he'd be the one bleeding. Jonah had no intention of giving anyone the chance to take what little he had left. Steel was honest. People were not. He was learning to live by that rule. As the stars blinked into the night sky, Jonah practiced until his arm ached, each throw sharper than the last. Greta watched, her expression unreadable, but the silence between them said more than any praise or critique could. Jonah felt the weight of her gaze, not heavy like Bram's judgment but like the quiet hand of someone who understood the path he was walking. It wasn't just about the blade. It was about trust forged in shared moments like this, where words felt unnecessary and progress spoke louder. Greta crossed her arms, leaning against the wall without breaking eye contact. Jonah couldn't help but wonder what she saw, what pieces of herself reflected back through him. If he missed the target, she never flinched. If he hit it dead center, she never smiled. And yet, her presence stayed, as if to say she believed in him even if she wouldn't say it aloud. The forge had begun to shape him, but it was Greta's quiet presence, unwavering, steady, that tempered the steel beneath his skin and sharpened his edge to something far deadlier. The fire molded the steel, but it was the hand that gave it purpose. And in that hand, Jonah saw more than calluses and burns, he saw the imprint of fate. Each hammer strike carried the weight of every choice he had yet to make, every step leading him further from the boy who scraped by on stolen bread. The blade, once shapeless, now held the echoes of that transformation, and as Jonah's fingers brushed its edge, he wondered if the steel could sense the shift too. A weapon, yes, but perhaps something more, a key to doors he hadn't yet imagined, or a chain that would bind him to whatever future he forged from this moment forward. Jonah, the weight of steel. NeoAlexandria, Lower District, 2136. The alley behind the forge never quite surrendered to silence. Even at night, the city's heartbeat drummed faintly, a hum of distant engines, the cries of vendors, and the occasional echo of footsteps in places where footsteps shouldn't be. Jonah stood in the cool shadows, the throwing knife Greta had handed him balanced in his palm, its blade catching the faintest traces of starlight. Greta leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed, the faint light catching on the scar that ran from her temple down to her jawline. Her jacket hung loose over wiry muscle, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms crisscrossed with thin, pale lines, old wounds, the kind that never quite faded. One boot tapped lightly against the stone, though her eyes stayed still and sharp, watching Jonah as if she had all the time in the world and nothing in it could surprise her. "You're holding it too carefully," she said, her voice soft but edged. "It's a tool, not glass. Grip it like you intend to make something bleed." Jonah's fingers tightened. The knife felt heavier than before, not in weight, but in consequence. A few weeks ago, he wouldn't have thought twice about pocketing it and running. Now, the idea felt wrong. There was something about standing here, under Greta's gaze, that made him want to prove he could carry it. Prove he wouldn't break under the weight. With a flick of his wrist, Jonah sent the knife spiraling toward the barrel in front of him. It struck the edge, spinning off and clattering to the ground. Greta sighed. "Better, but you're still thinking too much. The blade isn't an answer, Jonah. It's a question, one that doesn't always have a clear response. Sometimes it's survival, sometimes it's fear wearing a sharper edge." Jonah knew what she meant. He could feel the weight of it, the uncertainty that hung in the air after each throw. A blade asked who you were willing to cut for, and more importantly, who you wouldn't hesitate to cut down. The edge wasn't just steel, it was a reflection staring back at him, daring him to decide who he'd become when the moment finally arrived. The sooner you realize that, the easier it'll find its target. He retrieved the knife, jaw tightening as he returned to his spot. Then what's the right answer? Greta's smile was faint, barely there. That's the thing. No one knows until it's too late. Jonah didn't respond. He knew better than to ask for easy lessons. Greta wasn't Bram, she didn't bark orders or fill silences with noise. Her teachings were quieter, and that made them linger longer, embedding themselves like splinters under his skin. They stayed there for hours. Jonah threw the knife until his shoulder burned and his fingers numbed. Greta corrected his stance, but never his determination. That, she seemed to leave untouched. The wind shifted, carrying the distant tang of rain and rust, and Jonah felt the weight of the city pressing down on him. The lower district didn't sleep, not really. In the corners of his vision, the shadows moved, and Jonah wondered if eyes watched them from the dark. "Why knives?" Jonah asked suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. Greta didn't answer immediately. She stared out over the market rooftops, arms still folded tight, as if she were holding something in. "Knives are honest," she said at last. "They don't lie about what they are. Guns can jam. Explosives can fail. But a knife? It does exactly what you make it do. If you miss, that's on you." Jonah nodded, weighing the knife in his palm. There was a purity to it, he realized. Simple. Unforgiving, like the streets he had grown up on. There were no second chances in the lower district, no indulgence for hesitation. The knife spoke that same truth, a cold honesty that mirrored the city's indifference. If the blade slipped, it wasn't the fault of the steel. It was Jonah's weakness laid bare for anyone to see. And in this part of the world, weakness invited knives from others who were faster, meaner, and hungrier. The blade was as much a teacher as Greta, and Jonah understood that to hold it was to hold a reflection of the life he was carving for himself. He threw again. This time the blade buried itself into the wood, vibrating slightly before settling. Greta's eyes flicked toward the target but said nothing. The alley's silence stretched again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jonah could feel something else lurking beneath it, an unspoken understanding that didn't need words to explain. As the first hints of dawn crept into the sky, Greta finally stepped away from the wall. "Enough for tonight," she said, the words more of a command than permission. Jonah lowered the blade, exhaling slowly. "Same time tomorrow?" Jonah asked, already knowing the answer. Greta paused at the edge of the alley, glancing back with the faintest tilt of her head. Jonah caught something in the hesitation, as if she were weighing a thought she wouldn't say aloud. For a fleeting second, he wondered if she saw herself in him, the same raw edges, the same quiet desperation masked beneath stubborn resolve. But just as quickly, whatever it was passed, and Greta's expression settled back into the unreadable calm she always wore. "If you want to be better, yes." Jonah watched her disappear into the haze of the lower district, the weight of the knife still heavy in his palm. He wasn't sure if the lessons were about throwing blades, or about carrying them when no one else would. The next evening, Jonah returned. Greta was already there, leaning against the same wall, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're late." Jonah shrugged, flipping the knife between his fingers as he crossed the alley. "Didn't think you'd notice." "I notice everything." Greta's eyes narrowed slightly, though the amusement lingered. "We're not stopping until you hit the mark 5 times in a row." Jonah glanced at the barrel, now riddled with punctures from the night before. He stepped into position without another word. The first throw struck dead center. The second veered just left. Jonah cursed under his breath, retrieving the knife. "You're gripping too tight," Greta said, her voice closer now. She moved behind him, lightly adjusting his arm. "Let the blade do the work." Her hand lingered for a second longer than necessary, and Jonah caught the faint scent of oil and steel. It was grounding, in a way. He nodded, exhaling before releasing the blade. This time, it found its mark. 4 more strikes followed. By the time Jonah finished, his breath was shallow, but the tension in his chest eased. Greta stepped back, nodding in approval. "Now let's see if you can do it under pressure." Jonah arched a brow. "Pressure?" She motioned toward the shadows beyond the alley. "The city's awake, Jonah. Sooner or later, you'll need to throw when someone's throwing back." Jonah's grip on the knife tightened. He didn't argue. By the time they finished that night, the stars had long since faded behind the smog. Jonah's arms ached, but the knife felt like an extension of his hand. Greta left first, as always, fading into the streets without a sound. Jonah lingered for a moment, the weight of steel a quiet reminder in his palm, cold, certain, and far more reliable than the promises people made in the lower district. He could almost hear Bram's voice in the back of his mind, warning that sooner or later, everyone bleeds for the choices they make. The knife would decide whether Jonah was the one left standing, or the one bleeding out in the gutter. And in a place like this, steel didn't care about fairness. It just waited for the hand that knew how to use it. The knife wasn't the point. But someday, it would be the only thing left standing between him and the world. Jonah, the blade in the shadows. NeoAlexandria, Lower District, 2139. 3 years had passed since Jonah first stood behind the forge, a boy chasing scraps of steel. Now he moved with the certainty of someone who had survived longer than he should have, each step measured and quiet. The streets of NeoAlexandria hadn't grown kinder, but Jonah had grown sharper. Tonight, the air smelled of rain and rust, the kind of night where knives stayed hidden until the last possible moment. Jonah leaned against the worn brick of an alley, his cloak pulled tight around his shoulders. The flicker of neon signs sputtered overhead, their reflection dancing in puddles at his feet. Greta's message had been short: "Meet me at the Serpent's Gate." The name alone was enough to twist Jonah's gut. The gate wasn't a place for casual business. It lay deep within the eastern sector, where the underbelly of the city lived openly. Jonah hadn't been there since the night Greta introduced him to Marcus Antonius. Jonah slipped through the crowded streets, the knife at his side a comforting weight. Steel was simpler than trust, and Jonah had learned long ago that the former rarely let him down. People were unpredictable, too many angles and hidden blades. But a knife? A knife was honest. It didn't care why you drew it, only that you knew how to use it. That was why Jonah kept it close. In the lower district, steel whispered louder than promises, and Jonah had stopped believing in the latter a long time ago. He remembered Marcus's eyes that night, sharp, calculating, the kind of gaze that measured a man's worth in heartbeats. Greta trusted him, which meant Jonah did too. But Marcus had his own plans, and Jonah knew enough about powerful men to stay wary. When Jonah reached the Serpent's Gate, Greta was already there, speaking in low tones with Marcus beneath the shadow of an old tramway. The Serpent's Gate wasn't marked by anything but the massive mural behind them, faded depictions of serpents coiled around figures in robes, their eyes hollow and dark. "You came," Greta said without turning. Jonah didn't bother responding. She knew he would. Marcus stepped forward, the slight limp in his stride barely noticeable. "Jonah, Greta says you've been keeping sharp." Jonah met his gaze. "I get by." Marcus smiled faintly. "You'll need more than that tonight." Jonah's eyes flicked to Greta, who gave the smallest of nods. That was all the confirmation he needed. Whatever this was, it wasn't simple. "There's a vault," Marcus began, his voice low. "One of the old ones, Anunnaki design, buried beneath the ruins of old Zion." Jonah frowned. "Vaults like that weren't cracked by accident. And you need me because..." "Because you don't flinch," Greta replied, stepping closer. "And because you've got something to prove." Jonah's grip tightened on the hilt of his knife. Greta wasn't wrong. Marcus led them deeper into the eastern sector, weaving between broken columns and rusted scaffolding until they stood before a crumbling temple facade. The stones loomed in quiet judgment, the scars of centuries etched across their surfaces like a story only the dead could read. Jonah felt it in his bones, the weight of forgotten power that hadn't faded, only grown patient. The vault beyond those doors hadn't been abandoned. It had been left behind, waiting for someone reckless enough to claim what it held, or foolish enough to think they could. The entrance yawned open like the maw of some forgotten beast, the darkness inside swallowing the faint light of the city behind them. As Jonah stepped inside, his fingers brushed the blade at his waist. Steel was honest, and tonight, he would need that honesty more than ever. The vault's corridor stretched endlessly, stone walls slick with condensation that reflected the dim light of Jonah's lantern. Every step echoed, swallowed quickly by the oppressive dark ahead. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, as if the vault itself resented their presence. Marcus walked ahead, tracing his gloved fingers along the wall, searching for something unseen. Greta followed behind Jonah, silent but watchful, her hand never far from the holster at her hip. Jonah's eyes swept the passage, each corner raising the hair on his arms. Vaults like this didn't just hide treasures, they swallowed the bones of men who thought they could outwit the dark. Jonah had seen enough to know the dead didn't guard gold out of kindness. If this place had been left behind, it was because the last poor bastard hadn't made it far enough to carry word back. Vaults like this didn't stay untouched for centuries without reason. "How do you know this place hasn't been picked clean?" Jonah asked, his voice low. Marcus didn't look back. Because the ones who tried didn't make it out. Jonah's grip tightened around the lantern handle. Comforting. They reached a chamber where the corridor split into 3 diverging paths. Marcus stopped, kneeling to inspect the ground. "Trap lines," he muttered. "Pressure sensitive. Crude, but effective." Jonah crouched beside him, tracing the thin, nearly invisible lines carved into the stone. "How old are these?" "Older than the city above us," Marcus replied. He drew a thin rod from his belt, pressing it lightly against the mechanism beneath the surface. The faintest click echoed through the chamber. "Stay to the sides. Step wrong, and the vault will bury us." Jonah rose, careful with each movement. Greta moved next, following Marcus's footsteps precisely. Jonah came last, shadows curling around his boots as he passed through the threshold. The path wound downward, spiraling into the heart of the vault. Strange carvings lined the walls, serpents entwined with mechanical gears, humanoid figures with elongated arms reaching skyward. Jonah couldn't tell if the vault builders worshipped the Anunnaki or feared them. Marcus paused at the next chamber, gesturing for Jonah to step forward. "It's your turn." Jonah frowned. "To do what?" Greta answered, resting her shoulder against the stone arch. "The vault needs a key. You've got the hands for it." Jonah stared at the massive circular lock embedded in the chamber door. Thin grooves traced spirals across its surface, interlocking in patterns that shifted with the faintest touch. Jonah stepped forward, placing his hand against the cold surface. The metal pulsed faintly beneath his fingers, as if the vault itself was breathing, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like an ancient heart buried deep in the stone. Jonah wondered if places like this recognized the ones who entered. There was a kinship in the stillness, a quiet acknowledgement that both he and the vault had survived things meant to break them. His breath slowed to match the thrum beneath his palm, and for the first time in years, Jonah felt as though he wasn't alone in the dark. "Feel for the tension," Marcus instructed, watching closely. "The lock will resist until you find the right sequence." Jonah closed his eyes, letting the silence settle over him. His fingers moved instinctively, tracing each spiral, testing each groove. One by one, the mechanisms shifted, their clicks growing louder. The final lock gave way with a deep, resonant thud. The chamber door groaned, sliding open inch by inch. Beyond lay a room untouched by time. In the center, a pedestal rose from the floor, and atop it sat an object wrapped in silk, glinting faintly in the lantern light. Marcus's eyes narrowed. There it is. Jonah stepped forward, careful not to disturb the stillness. He peeled back the silk, revealing a dagger unlike any he had seen, its blade etched with glowing blue runes, pulsing softly like veins beneath the surface. Greta's breath caught. Is that? Marcus nodded. Anunnaki craftsmanship. The blade of the rift. Jonah lifted it carefully, the weight of it both familiar and foreign. Every weapon felt like an old friend, the kind he never wanted but always needed. The dagger settled in his hand with an ease that made Jonah uneasy, as if the steel recognized him just as much as he recognized it. Tools like this had a way of sticking around, long after the blood had dried. He could feel the power humming beneath his fingertips. The blade wasn't just a weapon. It was a key to something far greater, and Jonah knew that tonight was only the beginning. The vault had given up its prize, but Jonah knew the blade wasn't leaving this place clean. The weight of it settled into his palm, heavier than steel had any right to be. Whatever slept beneath those runes wasn't meant for peace. Greta's gaze met his, a flicker of warning in her eyes, but she didn't stop him. Marcus watched like a man who had seen too much already, his expression unreadable. Jonah sheathed the blade, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the chamber's silence. Some doors, once opened, never closed the same way again. As they left the vault behind, Jonah could feel it. The city above would press in tighter, and soon, the shadows he walked through wouldn't let him pass unnoticed. Steel was honest, but the things it carved from the world rarely were. Jonah tightened his grip and stepped into the waiting dark. Jonah, the path forged in shadow. NeoAlexandria, Resistance Safe House, 2141. The blade hummed softly in Jonah's hands, the glow of its runes reflecting in his tired eyes. 2 years had passed since the vault beneath Old Zion. 2 years since he first felt the weight of the Anunnaki's legacy. The knife hadn't left his side since. Jonah sat on the edge of the cot, elbows digging into his knees, staring at the worn map of NeoAlexandria pinned to the wall. The edges curled like burned parchment, riddled with smudges and faint bloodstains from missions that had left more than marks on paper. His fingerprints still lingered in the corners, ground into the map's fabric from restless nights spent tracing paths through the streets he knew too well. Each crease spoke of places where plans had faltered, and each tear reminded him of allies who never made it back. The map was more scar than guide now, a testament to how much of himself he'd left scattered across the city. His gaze drifted to the southern districts, where the Resistance's hold was strongest. The northern zones, where the city bled power directly into the hands of the Dominion, glared back like a wound no blade could close. Marcus's voice echoed from the adjacent room, calm but stern. A debriefing for the newer recruits. Jonah remembered his first. He remembered Greta's smirk as Marcus told him he had potential but lacked the experience to use it. "You'll find your edge soon enough, boy," Marcus had said. Jonah found it that night during the vault heist, and in every mission since. The first job Marcus handed Jonah was a retrieval, simple, by Resistance standards. A shipment of medical supplies had gone missing in the market sector, hijacked by Dominion-backed smugglers. Jonah didn't ask why Marcus sent him alone. When he returned bloodied but successful, Greta simply handed him a cloth to clean the knife. "You handled it," she said. It wasn't praise, but it wasn't criticism either. Jonah learned to live in the space between the two. Then came the data vault beneath the old ministry, a forgotten labyrinth of servers protected by decaying tech and sentry bots too stubborn to die. Jonah slipped past traps that would have diced men twice as careful. When the power grid collapsed behind him, he left carrying 3 drives and a new scar across his collarbone. Greta laughed when she saw it. "The vault didn't like you much, huh?" Jonah only shrugged. The drives held Dominion schematics for an Anunnaki war machine Marcus believed the Resistance could use, or destroy. Jonah didn't care which. By the end of the first year, Jonah's name carried weight in the lower district. Power had a way of slipping into a man's bones, heavier than steel. It made Jonah walk a little straighter, speak with a quieter confidence, but it also painted a target on his back. Men respected weight, but they respected the chance to take it from you even more. Jonah could feel the eyes that followed him now, not out of curiosity, but calculation. The blade at his side didn't silence the whispers. If anything, it made them louder. Men who once dismissed him now met his gaze, and those who didn't found themselves watching his shadow. Greta began pulling Jonah into missions alongside her, a silent acknowledgement of trust. They worked in tandem. She handled the explosives, he handled the blades. They were ghosts moving through the city's underbelly. But ghosts couldn't fight shadows forever. The night the rift tore through NeoAlexandria, Jonah stood atop the market spire, watching the skyline writhe as if the city itself had cracked open, spilling light and shadow in equal measure. The air shimmered with an unnatural heat, warping the towers into silhouettes that twisted and shifted like mirages. Sparks of code drifted down from the sky, dissolving before they touched the ground. From below, the people of the market froze, caught between awe and terror as the world split at the seams. Jonah felt the pulse of it, a low thrum that reverberated in his bones, as if the city's heart had skipped a beat. For a moment, he wondered if he was standing in NeoAlexandria at all, or somewhere else entirely, somewhere older, darker, and far less forgiving. Marcus called it a crack in the system, but Jonah recognized it for what it was, an opening. He entered the rift alone. What he saw inside wasn't for Marcus, or even Greta. The Metasphere twisted time and memory, and in the heart of it stood an Anunnaki warlord, waiting as if Jonah had been summoned. They fought in silence, blade against spear, until Jonah severed the warlord's arm and claimed the fragment of code that held the rift together. When Jonah emerged, the tear in the sky had sealed, and Marcus only nodded. "I figured you'd make it back." The missions blurred together after that. Jonah became the hand Marcus trusted when others hesitated. The blade was always part of him now, as much a weapon as it was a reminder that his life, for better or worse, wasn't his alone anymore. There was the skirmish in the water district, where Dominion forces set fire to the Resistance's supply lines. Jonah cut through smoke and steel that night, leaving behind nothing but bodies and scorched footprints. Greta found him afterward, watching the flames smolder. "You're not sleeping enough," she said, leaning beside him. Jonah didn't reply. He didn't need to. The knife grew heavier with each mission. By the time Jonah led his own team into the Metasphere, there were whispers that he'd gone too deep, that he'd stayed too long on the other side. The Metasphere wasn't meant to be walked alone. It changed people, leaving pieces of them behind in the circuits and wires. Jonah emerged, but he wasn't the same. His eyes held the static of that digital world, fractured and distant, as if the Metasphere had left fingerprints on his soul. He moved like a man standing in two places at once, one foot grounded in NeoAlexandria, the other lingering in the circuits and coded shadows of the rift. Greta noticed it the moment she saw him, but said nothing for a while, as if afraid words might shatter the fragile balance holding him together. Part of him wondered if he had truly stepped out at all, or if the Jonah she saw was only the part that hadn't yet faded into the world he left behind. "You're losing something," she said. Jonah glanced down at the blade, its runes flickering faintly in the low light. "Maybe," he replied, sheathing it. But he kept moving. Because that's what survivors did. Now, Jonah sat in the quiet of the safe house, listening to the distant hum of the city. Greta leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You're restless," she said. Jonah didn't look up. It's not over. Greta smirked. It never is. He tightened his grip on the blade, feeling the hum beneath his skin. Marcus's voice called from the hall. Another mission. Another night beneath NeoAlexandria's endless sky. Jonah rose, the weight of the blade a reminder that survival wasn't the goal, it was the price of the path he walked. The knife had outlasted more than just enemies. It had outlived friends, soaked in the blood of those who had stood beside him but didn't make it back. Each scar it wore, each nick along its edge, told stories he tried not to remember. But Jonah knew better. Survival wasn't a reward. It was a debt that only grew heavier with every step forward, and the blade in his hand made sure he never forgot it. And the path was far from finished.